Hadrian's Wall is probably not what you think it is. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, English Heritage, and I'll come back to that, as well as the National Trust who care for much of it, promotes the wall as a tourist destination. A unique Roman monument, or rather almost unique, that was on the edge of the Roman Empire, with civilization lay on one side, with barbarians to the north, whose ramparts were patrolled by Roman legionaries for 300 years. It inspired George Martin, author of Fire and Ice, and the television epic Game of Thrones, whose ice wall protected the kingdoms from ice zombies and winter, and representations of Hadrian's Wall as a kind of Fortress Britain are found in the 2004 Arthurian movie, and the more recent Last Legion, and the Eagle, which also dip back into the mystery of the disappearance of the 9th Roman Legion, who supposedly never returned from an expedition north, and who also feature in our story. And there is also the iconic Sycamore Gap, that just so happened to be between Dover and Nottingham in the 1991 Robin Hood movie, Prince of Thieves. The wall is personal. At the age of 8, I got taken up there by my family for a walking and youth hosteling holiday, which is in some circumstances an oxymoron. That's my dad. His ashes were spread to the winds up here, he loved it so much. We took the night train up to Newcastle when everything was black and white and the carriages were like something out of 39 Steps. Our first port of call at dawn was Saxon, fragments of the Roman fort at Wall's End, nestled among a housing estate in the urban sprawl of Newcastle. Since then, the housing has been demolished and the site revealed complete with modern visitors centre. We then caught the bus to do the most popular section, like every other tourist. I did ask lots of questions, like why aren't we doing the whole length? And at 73 miles I was evidently overestimating my abilities. But the answer I got was that the other half was just a turf wall or earthen bank. Other questions included, why is it always raining? Why don't I have a pair of boots like the other walkers? Although I did get a brand new pair of black shoes, which was special, as I always had brown ones. And when you walk along the central section, who would dispute that to the north was a bleak barbarian wilderness, perhaps full of ice zombies, or blue Mohican type Picts or Vikings even, and this wall kept them out of rolling English countryside. Yes, English heritage. It certainly isn't English. That nation was invented in 1016. A more accurate name would perhaps be England's heritage. In Scotland it is historic environment Scotland, and in Wales it's Cadw, meaning simply to keep, but I digress. English heritage promotes this illusion of the frontier, so it's no surprise that some people wrongly think Hadrian's Wall follows the border between the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England. Wales is not a kingdom, it's a principality that has an English prince imposed on it. But Wales does form part of the story, and the idea of a border between Scotland and England persists in popular culture, featuring in the 2008 Doomsday movie, Doomsday. The puzzle is that Hadrian's Wall is almost unique, because it doesn't fit into anything we know about the Romans, their military, or their empire, and in many respects it was completely useless. I say almost unique in that the only time it was copied was 20 years later to the north, between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde, during the reign of Antonine, hence the Antonine Wall. When I first visited, we started in the east and went to the middle. For this documentary, I started in the west at sunrise on the Solway Firth, where the wall extends 10 miles along the coast to the village of Bowness. And whilst there is a tradition of raiding across the border, even in recent centuries, given this is the only one point the wall is within a mile of Scotland, the Scots came across one night to steal the church bells apparently. But 10 miles of defended fortification along this natural fortification of a muddy estuary does seem excessive. Along this western border, the line between the civilised Roman south and the barbarian north is hard to determine, especially since most traces of the earth and turf wall have been erased on these fertile coastal plains. There are aspects to the design of the wall that make no sense. What is wrong with this picture? It's a lookout tower, built in the bottom of a ditch when it should be at least a few metres either side to function. There are mile forts whose sloping internal ground will make occupation by troops difficult, if not impossible. And if the purpose of mile forts was to serve as a gateway, why is this on the hill rather than the nearby valley pass? And at the central fort of Housesteads, the north gate, supposedly to control the flow of barbarians into the Roman world, goes nowhere and clearly not practical. What of the forts like Housesteads and Chesters? These were cavalry forts, complete with stables. The men and horses shared the same barracks. Does it make sense that a mobile army was assigned to man the watchtowers? And how would they get horses on the wall in the first place? In fact, what is noticeable is that getting anyone on the wall would be tricky. At no point are there steps, not in the mile castles, not in the turrets, not along the wall. Then there is the vallum, a huge earthwork behind the wall. The vallum, or fosse or ditch, is 7 metres wide and 3 metres deep. It's flanked by ramparts and cut through rock in places. Thought to be the first barrier, it appears to be the last, and evidently made it difficult to access the wall, as 50 years later parts were filled in to enable access, so increase the number of crossing points. And there is no road linking the forts and mile castles in between. A military road is evident around Housesteads, but again built decades later. These design features appear to be cutting off easy access from the south. And then there are the number of troops needed to make it an effective fortification, over 300 years. The National Trust imagines 10,000 troops garrisoning the border. And given the estimate for the total number of troops in Britain numbered 30 to 40,000, this would have been an impossible drain on resources. Hadrian's Wall has 80 mile castles, the 5th mile castle being a full-blown fort, 11 in total, each with a gate through the wall, and 160 lookout towers. If just a handful of soldiers garrisoned just the mile castles, it's been estimated between 1,500 to 2,000 troops would have been involved in policing the border. And it certainly would have been useless if a fictitious invasion of 20,000 or more chose to attack, given they would have been strung out over 73 miles. And returning to the most iconic of wall images, why build the most spectacular structure on the top of a cliff? Surely the Romans were not expecting Pictish hordes to climb the cliff and then a 15-foot wall. Of course, the Roman military were expecting no such thing. Prior to the construction of the wall, and for over 40 years of Roman occupation of the north of Britain, the Romans followed normal military tactics. The Roman army was a mobile force. It did not fight from behind fortifications. It did the sieging. And it was the most efficient fighting in open country. Before we get to Roman tactics, let's expose a few myths. Hadrian's Wall defended against the Scots. Scotland, the land of Scots, did not come into being until many hundreds of years later. The Scots were Irish invaders colonising the West in the 5th and 8th centuries. The natives either side of the wall shared a similar identity. They spoke the same Celtic language, which is subtly different to the Gaelic the Scots-Irish introduced. Britain could be divided into 2 main groups. Southerners, who were mainly arable farmers, and like the Roman soldiers ate a largely vegetarian diet, with porridge and bread as a staple, and who developed settlements similar to towns. And Highlanders, living in the mountainous west, in what is now known as Wales, and in a line roughly north of Manchester to York were tribes who were largely pastoral herders living in smaller communities. Highlanders and Lowlanders. And it's likely there was a bit of snobbery between the cultured southerner town dwellers and the more brutish northerners. Oh, how things have changed in 2,000 years. There is a distinctive third group, again defined by geography. In the far north of Scotland, along the coast and on the islands, are the distinctive Broch, a roundhouse tower considered purely defensive. By my personal viewers, they are also very visible adverts for passing traders in an economy that was more maritime, and dependent on the seas rather than the difficult terrain inland. And if you want to trade, you need footfall. The next issue is rebellious Britons, and throughout the 400 years of occupation, Rome was forced to garrison 3 legions. Britain swallowed up a tenth of all the manpower of the Roman army. The only other province to prove to be so costly was Palestine. But the southerners were relatively quick to embrace the luxury of living in the empire, and even prior to the invasion in 43, had traded with the continent and grown accustomed to wine and luxury goods such as tableware. The next myth is the Roman army. They were professionals, but for the most part, life as a legionnaire was uneventful. 3 legions were stationed in Britain, and beyond any campaigns, that may be years or even decades apart, a soldier serving 25 years may never actually see battle. And as for battle, our understanding is shaped by popular culture, most of which is wrong. Despite a legion numbering 5,000, in actual conflict they were frequently outnumbered. Success came through training and discipline, and operating as a tight-knit killing machine. One-on-one battles may look good for cinema, but they did not lead to success. Kubrick's Spartacus at least gets the mobilisation correct, but the drama quickly degenerates into unhistoric theatre. HBO's epic Rome series did have a few scenes of accuracy. In the fight against the Gauls, we see the army in tight formation, protected by a wall of shields, with the first 2 rows of legionnaires being switched out to maintain the assault. The veterans were kept in reserve, who were said to complain about the lack of action. Another myth, again perpetuated in the movies, is the archer. The Romans did bring a cohort of 500 Syrian archers with the invasion, and they may have been stationed in Britain for the rest of the century, but they didn't man the walls, and they would have been a fairly insignificant contribution to the army in Britain beyond offering a long-range weapon defending infantry. And likewise, Britons did not use archery in combat. They used spears and long swords for close combat. Hadrian's Wall is part of the story of the conquest of Britain. It was a conquest that occurred over centuries, and a summary of that demonstrates just how old the wall is. As Roman military tactics were about mobility, the soldiers built the roads, being key military infrastructure. Incidentally, one of the great periods of Hadrian's Wall's destruction was in the mid-18th century, when Bonnie Prince Charlie was attacking England as part of the Jacobite risings. England's General Wade built a straight military road between Newcastle and Carlisle, following the route of Hadrian's Wall and using a substantial section as foundations. Many assume this straight road along the course of the wall is Roman. Wade also built an extensive military road network in the Highlands to aid in crushing the Scots. Roman road building followed the 40 years of campaigns to subdue the British. Claudius's invasion in 43 followed the route of an existing roadway now known as Watling Street that ran from Dover to Shropshire. Watling Street is its later name, perhaps the Romans knew it as Via 1. 5 legions, numbering just over 25,000 heavy infantry, accompanied by a similar number of auxiliaries of light infantry and cavalry, as well as the cohort of Syrian archers, and a squadron of elephants, invaded at Dover, and made its way up to the Thames crossing now known as London, and on towards St Albans, and then north-east to Colchester, to subdue the Trinovantes. Between 43 and 47, the governor of the newly conquered province, Ullius Plautius, continued the campaign up to what's now known as the Fosse Way, a Roman road that extends 250 miles between Exeter and Lincoln, and the effective border of the empire. For the following 30 years, Roman governors made inroads, literally. The forward control base of York was established by Caersws, who led the 9th Legion in 71. The location appears to be between the 2 dominant tribes of the north, the Brigantes and the Perassi, the former being a client kingdom of Rome from at least 50, but the king, Venantius, ended the agreement in 69, in a rather messy divorce between the empire and his queen. Agricola, who was the next governor from 77, was occupied subduing the Brigantes and their northern tribal allies. Brigante reluctance to be part of the empire continued for another century or more, with rebellions kicking off every few decades, and historian Tacitus mentioning that at some point they were led by a queen. You can see where Game of Thrones got some of its ideas from, with a king and ultimately the queen of the north. The most relevant rebellion was 40 years later. In 83, Agricola pushed north and established a timber fort at the River Irthing crossing, now Carlisle. Around the same time, the fort of Corbridge was also established on the crossing of the Tyne. Connecting these 2 vital frontier forts was Stonegate, Roman Road. The name is late and simply means Stone Gate. Agricola pushed north, right into the Highlands of Scotland, and after a huge battle at Mons Grappius, whose location is not known, subdued the Picts, at least as far as a line that runs from modern Glasgow to Aberdeen, constructing a military border of forts, roads and lookouts in a kind of proto-Hadrian's Wall. National Roman rule lasted no more than a decade or two before retreating back to Staingate. Agricola was recalled to Rome in 84. No governor in the following years was worthy of a mention in Roman histories, and the conquest of Britain was largely over. Particularly relevant to Hadrian's Wall, much of the army were not legionnaires. In the case of the British garrisons, half or more were auxiliaries. These would have been light infantry, as opposed to the legionnaires who were heavy infantry, and cavalry. Recruited from the Empire, auxiliaries, unlike legionnaires, were not citizens, but would gain citizenship on completion of their 25-year tour of duty, and pass it on to their children. Although the Roman aristocracy were termed knights, they would not have made up the crack troops featured in the film Gladiator, although they would have been led by a Roman citizen of rank. They didn't have stirrups, and the horses were tough little ponies. They rode in formation, they wore chainmail developed by the Gauls, not plate armour, and wielded a longer sword originally developed by the Celtic Iberians. Oh, and there certainly were no Spaniards. They would have either been Romans, who colonised the province of Iberia, or native Iberians. As archaeology reveals more of the war's past, so the importance of cavalry is very much part of that history. And there's a personal irony. Cavalry tactics have changed little in 2 millennia, as indeed the weapons of lance and sword. My father, who described the wall as being mainly manned by infantry, was in fact a cavalryman, part of the royal household. In conflict they traded horses for armoured cars, and he served in a rebellious part of the British Empire in 1950s Cyprus. And as such, if he'd known the importance of cavalry played in the frontier, would have had an amazing insight in what it meant to be a soldier on the edge of the civilised world. Whilst the infantry fought out in the open, in formation, the cavalry, or ala as they were called, which literally means wings, were there to deter the main body of the attack being flanked. They would also charge approaching infantry and enemy cavalry to break up any formation. Their other tasks would be scouting and skirmishing, and this would have been their main role along the northern border, and had also been able to harass any column of Celtic warriors, who likewise would have been mounted well before they reached the main infantry formation, and go into pursuit of any raiding parties or rustlers. An activity in this area that survived into recent centuries. The Housesteads Fort Farm was home to Hugh Nixon in 1604, stealer of cattle and receiver of stolen goods. Despite being non-citizens, cavalry were the elite fighting force and paid better than legionnaires. They shared their lives with their horse and spent their time when not on military duties, either training or showing off in the arena, and there are records they engaged in tournaments similar to those of the medieval period. And what do you do when you get good pay and live in the back of beyond? Well, they bought bling. Lots of bling. Bling for themselves and bling for their horse. On occasion, if they weren't buying bling, it seemed they bought stone in the form of altars for their Mithras temples and tombstones for themselves. They would have looked like true shining knights, and the British Celts would have been impressed, perhaps even envious. They too were not shy of a bit of bling for their horses, and the Celtic horse god Epona was even accepted into the Roman pantheon. Staingate, 40 years before the wall was built, had 8 small forts every 6 or 7 miles. A bigger fort of Vindolanda, roughly between Carlisle and Corbridge, grew out of one of these small forts. The Staingate fort of Vindolanda revealed preserved wooden tablets, or rather very thin wood or very thick paper with black ink, with everyday letters and memorandum, and even a birthday party invite by the camp commander's wife to a wife of another camp commander. One such status report reveals the commander is understrength and has 752 men rather than 800, and of them 337 are stationed in another fort and 46 are on escort duties. At Corbridge, which was also a supply base with granaries and repair shops, between 500 and 720 cavalry were stationed, with another cavalry regiment of 500 men in Carlisle, which gives us a total of around 2,000 soldiers defending the Empire's northern border, with the 9th Legion of 5,000 men and as many auxiliaries garrisoned at York 100 miles away, which if they marched hard would mean they could provide relief in 4 or 5 days. For 30 years or so this arrangement appeared to be adequate, although there seems to be some conflict with northern tribes, with the wooden supply base and stables at Corbridge being burnt down in 105, and the central fort of Vindolanda being upgraded at this time, and a change of regiment. The garrisoning of legions indicates the level of threat and the value of the area they were protecting. 30 years on from the invasion, 2 garrisons are found on the Welsh border, with the whole of the north protected by just one, and there's a reason for this. Despite the north being almost equal in territory, there were not the resources an empire needed. Wales, on the other hand, was rich in iron, gold, lead, silver and copper, and its mountainous and upland terrain made it difficult to subdue, as did its rebellious occupants. Wales was a Wild West. Legions were stationed close by to prevent any serious military action, and outposts brought trade to a people happy to sell their resources and skills. This brings us to the troops stationed in Britain. The 3 legions garrisoned at the end of the 1st century were the 2nd Legion Augusta, that formed part of the original invasion force, and they were stationed in Exeter in 55, moved up to Caerleon, meaning Fortress of the Legion in Welsh, in South Wales around 75, and remained there at least until the 3rd century. The 20th Legion Valeria Victrix, who at the end of the 1st century was stationed in Chester, and with the exception of deployment in other campaigns, stayed there till the end of the Roman occupation. By far the most famous legion was the 9th Hispania, stationed in York. Prior to Hadrian visiting in 122, the province has suffered a major rebellion from 119 to 121. The details are hazy, but it is this year that the 9th Legion just vanished from the record, and the replacement in 122 move into York and are commissioned to construct the wall on Hadrian's orders, and possibly design, as he fancied himself as a bit of a creative in all numbers of areas, including architecture, and one of those creative inspirations was to paint the wall white. The notion of the 9th were lost on an expedition north of the wall is entirely fiction and pure speculation, first found in the 1950s children's adventure Eagle of the Ninth, written by Rosemary Sutcliffe. The recent movie Centurion has the fictionalised legion venture north and, spoiler alert, betrayed by their Celt scout who leads them into a trap, which is based on the real battle of Teutoburg Forest, where the legions were lured into a trap and destroyed by the Germanic tribes in 9. The very limited history of the British Rebellion indicates that it was northern tribes, but south of Stonegate. The Romans were not big on recording defeats, but there are some clues. A commander of a legion would be a young man from aristocracy. After serving as a commander, he would return to Rome as a consul, and then go on to be governor and even emperor. Roman writers were more interested in the politics of Rome and the gossip about the elites. So one of the clues we have about the fate of the 9th Legion is in the writing of the elites. Lucius Caerus was tribune of the 9th during the 119-121 conflict in Britain, and he went on to lead another legion and quickly climbed the ranks as first consul and then governor of Arabia, all before he was 50. Lucius Suetonius took over the command of the 9th in 121, and then he promptly disappears from the records for 25 years. It is only when he is 50 he gets to lead another legion and then go on to become a consul and then governor, a few years after Hadrian dies. It is possible that Lucius Suetonius was captured and only returned to civilization years later, but it's more likely that he disgraced himself in the eyes of the Emperor Hadrian, no doubt having his legion wiped out by the Britons, and has to wait for a new emperor, Antonine, to habilitate him back into the elite. Hadrian's visit to Britain is in response to a crisis, and he brings with him a specially assembled legion of 3,000 legionnaires drawn from different legions from the continent, as well as the replacement legion for the 9th. Hadrian brings order, and he's also keen on a multicultural Roman Empire, to a degree at least, to keep the peace. He oversees the erection of a shrine in York to Britannia, a divine personification of Prydain, or Britain, a goddess we all carry around to this day in our pockets. And he not only initiates the building of the wall, but a model town in what is now Aldborough, Yorkshire, for the local chieftain of the Brigantes, and naming it Azurum Brigantium, that developed into a town of some luxury and also a regional administrative centre. To the east and south, the bordering tribe of the Parisii are also seen to be given a new town. The fort is abandoned in 125 and turned over to the local tribe to become their administrative centre, which they appear to have named For, or Pretoria, perhaps named after the city's walls or gates, and it was evidently prosperous, cultured and wealthy, and is gifted as theatre in 140 by Marcus Generius, whose dedication stone survives. It could be speculated that Hadrian, having beaten the main northern tribe, is lavishing civilization on them. The Brigantes, however, remained rebellious. 30 years later, though, part of another uprising, and probably again 50 years later. Emperor Hadrian, when designing the wall, took his lead from the Roman fort, with its ditch, gates, wall and turrets, but did add the vallum to evidently guard from attack from the south. Roman forts were of course defensive structures. The most basic was a marching fort, dug at the end of each day, with a simple ditch and bank as defence, with additional timber walls if material were at hand. Campaign forts were more permanent, with timber barricades on earth embankments, and these would be replaced with stone structures. The design was universal: 4 gates, and a courtyard where the commander would be housed, and a grid of roads, and accommodation in tents if temporary, or barracks or stables or stores or workshops if required. In the event of an attack, the perimeter was kept clear to marshal the troops into formation. Hadrian's Wall, in part, is a linear version of a fort, with fortified gates, lookout posts, a ditch and barricade. In the event of attack, the assembled troops would exit the camp in formation. The fort was not a castle. It was a forward control base for offensive operations. Supply forts may have had a more defensive design, firstly to prevent theft or pillage, and to be able to hold out until a rescue force arrived. Celtic tribes have made the mistake of retreating to their ancient hill forts. Vercingetorix of the Gauls did so with 80,000, and Caesar used siege warfare to starve them out into the open. The huge fort of Maiden's Castle in Dorset fell to the Roman invasion despite the elaborate gateway and impressively deep ditches and tall ramparts. Likewise, the rebellion by Caractacus that ended in a showdown in mid-Wales, the ramparts fell to a Roman organised military strategy. Incidentally, there's only one historic example of a Roman army under siege, and that was under Julius Caesar in Alexandria as he waited for reinforcements. Fortified towns and forts had embankments behind the walls. This is most noticeable at Silchester. This allowed troops to find cover as well as access the ramparts. Housesteads too had internal ramparts, and given there are no steps to access the wall evident along either the wall, in the mile castles or turrets, is it more likely the wall originally had earthen ramparts, as indeed the turf and timber section of the wall had. And are we right to assume it was castellated? Now, castellations are found on medieval castles. It allows defenders to find cover and then attack with slings, arrows and spears through the gaps in the wall. But there's no evidence at Silchester of any kind of wall at the top of the rampart. And the most intact forts, the Saxon shore forts found along the coast in southern Britain, which is some of the best preserved Roman walls in the world, show little evidence of original castellation. It and others surviving as part of later medieval castles. So where did the idea come from that Hadrian's Wall had such a design feature? Sure, the medieval maps of Britain denotes the wall as castellated, but it also does for the Antonine Wall, which would have been no more than a mound and a ditch, as was the eastern half of Hadrian's Wall. And what of the forts on the wall? Apart from those at key points on river crossings, it seems remarkably underused. Housesteads, for instance, whilst having a number of alterations over centuries, notably during times of crisis, has few coins, and coins are a good indication of occupancy. The biggest spike in lost coins coincides with the construction period, and with the 3rd century crisis in the Empire, which also includes buried hoards, whereas the total coin count over 300 years is just 600 or so, excluding buried hoards. The fort of Corbridge on Staingate produced over 7,600 coins over this same period. Other wall forts also have low coin counts in comparison to Staingate forts. Housesteads is like some model fort, built to impress rather than be a functional military base, to the point its water supply was entirely reliant on rainfall, which is an issue with a cavalry fort. Horses drink a lot. Yes, it was occupied for periods over its 300-year life, most notably from about 175 to 207 when we see Phase 2 building work, and then again in 300 when there's a spike in coins lost or hoarded. And the final phase of building was at the end of Roman occupation, when it seems Hungarian infantry, originally recruited from a Germanic tribe in now modern Belgium, made the fort and Britain their home. These occupation phases coincide with unrest. We know in 175 a large force of Sarmatian cavalry from Iran, consisting of over 5,000 men, arrived in Britannia, probably to reinforce troops fighting unrecorded uprisings. In 180, Hadrian's wall was breached by the Picts, and the commanding officer, or governor, was killed there in what Cassius Dio described as the most serious war of the reign of Commodus, the emperor of gladiator fame, who did love his circus and was assassinated by his wrestling trainer, who strangled him in the bath, rather than fighting in the arena. What is clear is that any uprising would have involved many thousands of men, if not tens of thousands, and would have either been Picts breaking through the wall and heading south, or northern tribes and part of the Brigantia Federation rebelling south of the wall. And whilst the wall and ditches would have been an obstacle to overcome, there is no mention of any desperate battle defending the wall, or archaeological evidence. Yet despite its inability to actually function as a barrier, there is evidence that it still served some purpose. The governor of Britain, Lucius Seneca, reports to Rome in 207, describes barbarians rebelling, overrunning the land, taking loot, creating destruction. It led him to ask the emperor for intervention with an expedition, and archaeology reveals the rebuilding of the parts of Hadrian's wall, particularly the earth and turf section in the west and forts beyond it. There is even Roman graffiti and an ancient quarry in Geltswood, Cumbria, just a few miles west of the Caerleon fort, dated to 207. The emperor did arrive with an expeditionary force, marched north to Scotland, and the tribes quickly sued for peace. These periods of unrest saw thousands of troops being brought into the country, and they would obviously needed bases, and in these periods we see building work and renovation along the wall. So to recap, Stanegate forts remained important throughout the occupation. The troops were mainly cavalry, numbering anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000, and the wall, a defensive structure that doesn't appear to have been used much beyond the three main river crossings, and which failed to prevent invading Picts, and which did not serve any military purpose in Roman fighting tactics. What is also evident is, despite the physical nature of the wall as a frontier, is that the real frontier was far more fluid and vague. Forts north of the wall were upgraded and used throughout the Roman period. Tribes north of the wall traded and often had good relations with the empire. Bremenium fort, for instance, which guarded the Roman road of Deer Street, over 20 miles north, was garrisoned throughout the Roman occupation. So what's going on here? Hadrian was aware that whilst there was a threat from beyond the frontier, there were two within the empire, notably the Briganti and their confederation of northern tribes, but also any governor of Britain who would have had 3 legions at his disposal, as well as a tenth of the entire Roman military, as well as a substantial part of the navy, and therefore could be a challenger for emperor. These fears were well founded. Clodius Albinus, in the 190s, as governor of Britain, proclaimed himself emperor following the death of Commodus. 100 years later, 2 more wannabe emperors emerged from Britain. In 306, Constantine the Great launched his successful campaign to become emperor from York. And in 386, Magnus Maximus, a Galatian, led a partly successful campaign to become the emperor of the Western Empire. It seems the rebellious nature of the Britons rubbed off on the Roman masters. Hadrian, by engaging the military in large construction projects, was able to occupy the legions and perhaps distract them from following their governor into another civil war. Hadrian also wanted to consolidate the empire. Further expansion simply was not delivering the lands and resources whilst carrying a huge cost. Perhaps experiencing Wales that, despite having a similar rebellious tribe, was able to deliver gold and resources without the need for expensive bases. But occupying legions for a decade or so, building the wall does not entirely explain the need for it. Along the Rhine and the frontier with the German tribes, he had a timber fence built, the limes. And whilst it would not have been a barrier to invading Germanic armies, it would have encouraged civilians to use custom posts, and most importantly, be a symbolic edge to civilization. Returning to Silchester, which is one of the best surviving Roman towns in Britain, demonstrates the significance of city walls. Many towns grew out of military forts that were defensive in that they allowed the army to mobilise and not be caught by a surprise attack. But city walls represented civilization, quite literally. Those outside the walls were pagans or rustic, 2 Latin words. The city walls allow for goods to be taxed as they were forced to go through city gates, and symbolically the gates represented a transition into a civilized world. The city world, where rules and customs were quite different. Life in the city was organised. It was policed. The Latin words polis and civil both refer to those in the city. The roads were organised. The housing, industry, commerce and government planned. The city was a microcosm of the empire. This symbolic architecture is also represented in the Colosseum and arenas. In the real empire, Rome and its provinces were surrounded by barbarians. In the arena, it was inverted. The civilized people of the empire were around the outside, and the outside world was in the arena. So Hadrian's Wall is symbolic architecture, a city wall to the entire empire with city gates on the main highways, north and south, where goods could be taxed, and outsiders, the rustic and pagan, would be reminded that civilization was different. But the wall goes further. It reminds those on the inside that they are in the civilized world, and it is policed. No longer is it acceptable to steal your neighbour's cattle, which appears to be a major pastime of the Celtic tribes. There were aspects to Celtic culture that could be assimilated, although modified. The Celtic nobility embraced wine and palatial quarters, and were no strangers to shaving and saunas prior to the Romans, so embraced the bathhouse. But there were a number of cultural differences that were more difficult to accommodate. The cattle rustling, the one-on-one hero combat, the ritualised warfare often associated with cattle rustling, and big showy hill forts. Whilst some hill forts ended up as refuges in battle, many appear to be one tribe simply displaying their importance, with huge earthworks that served little defensive purpose. Maiden's castle, that did hold out against the Roman invasion for a short period, has the most elaborate entrance, a maze almost, but its back entrance is notably less impressive. 40 miles north of Hadrian's Wall is a truly impressive hill fort, Yavering Bell, a centre of the Vertadini tribe, although it appears to be more symbolic than actually practical. Huge stone walls encircle the hill, and the pale grey stone would have stood out for miles around. And with over 130 buildings within its 5-hectare sides, and with walls 10 feet thick and 8 foot high, this was a Celtic time to rival any of that found in Roman Britain. And it is an extremely steep climb, making it not the most practical of towns. And for defence, the hill is pretty effective without putting up such a colossus structure. When the Saxons invaded the area, they set up a palace right next door, but in the valley. And it's not alone across the Celtic world to build henge monuments of significance. We just don't know what they really were for. Perhaps it was to show off the power of the tribe. The Vertadini tribe had fairly friendly relations with Rome, although for the most part remained free, acting as a buffer state, and perhaps this monument with its white granite stone walls inspired Hadrian to show off the power of the Roman tribe, and just to reinforce that fact, also have it painted white. The musings in this video are speculation. I don't have any additional insight into history, but I do think that the wall's history as currently presented is simplistic, and certainly less interesting than the evidence would suggest. And the real history is certainly a lot more intriguing. So what do you think? Leave a comment. If you like the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and if you want to support this channel, consider being a patron via Patreon. And special thanks to my contributors, links are found in the description, and my producers.